Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. The Tinker class concept has easily become the most popular one out there, and for good reason. It fills a hole in WoW's class fantasies, has lots of in-universe precedent, and can easily be mapped to 3 different roles. The fact that we've made it to 20 years and 13 classes, 4 of those added after vanilla, without Tinkers being added, honestly boggles the mind. Aside from Death Knights, they've been the most obvious addition to make, yet they keep getting passed up. Honestly, the best reasoning I can think of for why we haven't gotten Tinkers yet is simply timing. The 2 most fitting expansions for them, Battle for Azeroth and The War Within, both immediately followed expansions that gave us a new class, and quite understandably, Blizz wouldn't want to add them consecutively, as each additional class is a permanent part of the game that must be maintained going forward. And honestly, at this point, I think that enough hype has festered around them that they would make for an extremely popular addition. I myself would love to see them, even if I'm unlikely to abandon my main for one. So, why do I think they should be a class? As I stated, there is a clear gap in the class fantasies available to us players. There simply aren't any that deal with technology, the closest being hunters with their traps. Meanwhile, we have almost 2 full classes that deal with wielding the light, and 2 classes built around demons in the Fel. Heck, they had to take away metamorphosis from warlocks to give it to demon hunters. And while other class concepts often sound cool, none of them feel like they'd be as unique as Tinkers. I know detractors will say that we already have the engineering profession to fulfill that fantasy, but that seems like such a bizarre argument. The scope of a class and a profession are worlds apart. Are magical classes defunct because enchanting exists? Are Death Knights and their runes defunct because inscription and its glyphs were added in the exact same expansion? Look, you can think Tinkers are lame or a waste of a class, and that's fine. But to deny that a tech class is the most obvious thing in the world that we don't yet have feels disingenuous. Secondly is the in-universe precedent for Tinkers, which has been there for a long time. The technology is clearly there. Hehehe. We also have prominent Tinker characters like Gazlowe, Mechatork, and Erasmin. Gazlowe himself headed up the Tinker-themed island expedition team, Gazlowe's Grease Monkeys, and there was a gnomish analog team known as Razik's Rough Riders. And did you know that violence has solved more conflicts than anything else in history? But aside from that, we also have literally everything from Mechagon, a bunch from Undermine, and a decent amount of tech from Draenei like Artificer Ramul, and Lightforged Draenei, and Dwarves, and Dark Iron Dwarves, and Earthen, and even Maghar and Forsaken to an extent. Also, many people have an unnecessarily narrow vision for Tinkers. You can easily incorporate alchemical elements into the class, which would tie it to characters like Farinell. I've already touched on the 10 most obvious races that Tinkers could be available to, but it is one of the more believable classes to extend to others. Certainly more so than monks, whose heavy focus on Pandaria's August Celestials make it hard to justify for non-Pandaren characters. And certainly more so than Evokers, who are hard to justify as anything other than Drakthir. Lastly, Tinkers can very intuitively be divided into 3 specializations, with 3 different roles and unique vibes. For tanks, we have the mech suit fantasy. Jump in and pilot your heavily armored Shredder or Shredder adjacent device and absorb those hits. For DPS, we have the Gunner archetype. Grab those guns, previously only usable by hunters, and shoot your enemies from afar while dropping down turrets that can also shoot your enemies from afar. And for healers, we have the Alchemist concept. Spray your allies with revitalizing chemicals, or inject them with concoctions that can heal their wounds or neutralize incoming sources of damage. There are a few main sources of inspiration for Tinker abilities, though we can think of more beyond that. For starters, we had the Goblin Tinker and Goblin Alchemist heroes from Warcraft 3. Many WoW classes take direct inspiration from one or more Warcraft 3 hero units. Shamans, for example, draw primarily from the Farseer and Shadowhunter heroes, as well as the Shaman, Witch Doctor, and Spirit Walker units. The Goblin Tinker had the Robo-Goblin mech suit, as well as cluster rockets, and a pocket factory that would automatically generate clockwork units to attack and then detonate on your enemies. The Goblin Alchemist had his healing spray, as well as a self-empowering chemical rage, a targetable acid bomb, and the ability to occasionally instantly kill weaker enemies by transmuting them into gold, which you could then use. I think transmute could be fun in a way similar to Touch of Death, though having it actually generate gold for the player would perhaps need to be cut to curb bot behavior. Unfortunately, Heroes of the Storm revitalized the Tinker concept with Gazlowe. The mech suit was kept, but he now utilized turrets, a delayed AoE stun bomb similar to Capacitor Totem, an aimable death laser, and a Sigil of Chains style Gravo Bomb 3000. Beyond these direct sources, we can also imagine other tools and mechanics available for implementation. Jet thrusters, grapples, and rocket boots for mobility, orcish iron stars, buzzsaws and crawler mines for damage, stasis traps, magnets and oil slicks for crowd control, heating vents for tank AoE. Heck, combine that or a flamethrower with the oil slicks and you've got gameplay similar to Blaze from Heroes of the Storm. He even has a bunker that can be used as an AoE raid defensive. And there is much more than that I'm sure other players and devs could think of. I'm just one guy after all. And it could certainly play differently than I would imagine, but there's definitely enough there. It is absolutely the strongest class concept we still have available to us. The only other real contender are bards, but those have way less of an established presence in Warcraft. Though I do like the recently floated idea of tying them to Azeroth's Radiant Song, and a bard would have to have at least one support spec, which, as augmentation proves, is a touchy hurdle. But hey, just to poke a hole in that concept, we recently got Rick Reverb as a raid boss that takes the bard concept and mechanizes it with subwoofers and amplifiers. So in conclusion, I would be pretty disappointed if we never see Tinkers. They just fit so well. Unfortunately, the odds of any class are fairly low unless they can be pitched as the elite super soldiers of the main antagonist of an expansion. Seriously, that's happened for 3 of the 4 added classes. Did nobody notice this internally? You really have to hand it to monks here for not relying on that hype factor to stimulate the class's popularity. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with the king of the gnomes himself, Gelbin Mechatork. He is one of the most prominent Tinkers in the game, eclipsed probably only by Gazlowe. Although because the video from 2 weeks ago was an impromptu one, I hadn't actually used Gazlowe yet. I just chose to go with Mechatork instead. And honestly, I don't really know how I feel about the guy, because unfortunately, he's a gnome and Blizzard really doesn't care about gnomes. Seriously, if we just look at in-game stuff, I think he was there for the retaking of Gnomeregan, which isn't even a complete thing. And other than that, it's just BFA. Granted, that thing in BFA was one of the best raid fights ever, so I have to give him credit for that. And then later the Mechagnomes of Mechagon rescued him from his life support capsule and named him their new king. But even now, we just don't really know the guy. He seems to be a whimsical and fun-loving guy, but how much of that is actually attributable to him, and how much of that is just him being a gnome? If we don't have a very specific reason to be following a character around, Blizzard seems content just throwing the same ones at us again and again. So, to that end, and because I feel like a lot of allied races are superfluous, I would have had Mechatork actually succumb to his injuries after he was retrieved from the pod, but only after he had enough time to interact with Erasmin and introduce him to the rest of gnome kind. I then would have had Erasmin serve as the king of all gnomes, with Mechagnomes just being customization options. This doesn't solve everything because Erasmin himself hasn't really been relevant after the Mechagon patch, but he did seem to exude a lot more personality than Mechatork himself, and why have 2 faction leaders ignored when you can keep it at 1? Now, I could have taken things very easy and just drawn Mechatork himself, but apparently I hate myself and decided to draw his entire mech suit as well. Seriously, at least for me, drawing mechanical stuff is exhausting. You just don't have a lot of give to work with, and there's usually a lot more details. I also gave him his trusty wrenched caliber, which seems impractical to use while piloting a mech suit, but hey, if an enemy manages to get up in his face, it's probably the more effective way of beating them back. And for the setting, I drew him in Dunmoreau, just outside the entrance to Gnomeregan. I really wrestled with the idea of just putting him in the Gnomeregan dungeon, and part of me regrets not doing that. But one problem I have with Gnomeregan is it doesn't actually feel like a city that people live in. Which, I mean, he is in a mech suit here, so it would have worked. Maybe I just didn't want to draw even more mechanical stuff than I already was. So you can just chalk that up to me being a bit lazy here. That'll be it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye!